On the morning of May 26, 1992, a man is held at gunpoint and quickly bundled into a car. Witnesses were left shocked. The man who had just been kidnapped was Charles Geschke, the co-founder of Adobe. By 1992, Charles Geschke had become one of the wealthiest men in Silicon Valley. The company he founded, Adobe, had by that time created innovative products such as Adobe Illustrator, a cutting-edge graphics program, Adobe Photoshop, one of the world's first photo editing softwares, and Adobe Premiere Pro, one of the world's first video editing software programs. Through its products, Adobe had been competing against some of the tech industry's biggest giants, which included companies like Apple. Adobe was holding its own, commanding a decent market share that had made its founders quite wealthy. When the kidnappers of Adobe's co-founder made contact, they demanded a six-figure ransom payment. During the kidnapping ordeal, Adobe was in the midst of an all-out war with its rivals, a war for the dominance of the creative software market. This is the story of the creative software wars, how Adobe crushed its competitors and survived its co-founder being kidnapped. Before they founded Adobe, John Warnock and Charles Geschke were both deeply involved in academia. John Warnock had a background in mathematics and computer science, earning a PhD in electrical engineering from the University of Utah, where he worked on computer graphics research. His PhD thesis was based on an algorithm he created, which made it easier for computers to render computer graphics. The algorithm broke apart complicated images into smaller parts that were easier for a computer to compute. It enabled computers to render solid objects at a time when most computer renderings were only line drawings. His research would land him a job at Evans & Sutherland, one of the most pioneering computer graphics companies of the 70s. Charles Geschke, on the other hand, also had a background in computer science and mathematics, earning his PhD from Carnegie Mellon University. Before getting his PhD, he had worked as a professor at John Carroll University. At the time, a new research center called the Xerox Palo Alto Research Center, or Xerox PARC for short, had just been set up by the highly profitable Xerox Photocopier Company. It aimed to explore research into the future of the office and computing technology so that it could be commercialized and help Xerox diversify its revenue streams. The lab was set up in 1970. Charles Geschke, who had become a well-respected academic and professor, was among some of Xerox PARC's earliest recruits. Joining Xerox PARC in 1972, his work contributed greatly to the creation of the revolutionary Xerox Star. In 1978, Geschke started the Imaging Sciences Laboratory at PARC and conducted research in the areas of graphics, optics, and image processing. He hired John Warnock. Together they focused on developing new ways to improve printing and document processing. Their most significant achievement was a project called Interpress, a page description language that allowed computers to communicate complex document layouts to printers with high precision. This was revolutionary at a time when digital printing was still in its infancy and traditional typesetting methods were dominant. Interpress was designed to enable printers to interpret and reproduce digital documents exactly as they appeared on screen, a crucial capability for professional publishing. Despite its potential, Interpress struggled to gain traction within Xerox. By the late 1970s, Xerox had changed. The visionary leadership that set up Xerox PARC was no longer at the helm of the company. It had been replaced by a short-term focused leadership that prioritized its highly profitable photocopier business. Warnock and Geschke were victims of the new leadership. They saw immense potential in their work on page description languages, but Xerox was unwilling to invest in commercializing it. Frustrated by the company's bureaucracy and lack of vision, in December 1982, they left Xerox and started Adobe Systems in a garage in Warnock's home in Los Altos, California. With just a handful of employees in the early days, among which were ex-Xerox PARC employees, the team started from scratch to create a page description language. They called this new language PostScript, and it was significantly better than Interpress, the page description language Warnock and Geschke had pioneered before they left Xerox PARC. PostScript promised to transform the printing industry by allowing printers to accurately reproduce digital documents with scalable, high-quality fonts and graphics, enabling documents to be printed out physically exactly as they appeared on computer screens. However, selling a new complex technology was not easy. The early days were marked by financial uncertainty and skepticism from potential investors and partners. Their breakthrough came in 1983 when Apple co-founder Steve Jobs saw the potential of PostScript. He was in the midst of developing the Apple LaserWriter, one of the first mass-market laser printers, and he needed a high-quality page description language to make it work. Upon seeing PostScript, Steve Jobs said, When the first page came out of LaserWriter, I was blown away. No one had seen anything like this before. I had this page up in my hand and said, who will not want that? I knew then, as John did, that this was going to have a profound impact. Jobs initially wanted to buy Adobe outright, but Warnock and Geschke refused to sell their company. Adobe investors urged the two co-founders to make a deal with Steve Jobs, so they settled on Apple becoming Adobe's first major investor, putting in $2.5 million for a 19% stake, plus a 5-year license fee for PostScript paid in advance. The launch of the Apple LaserWriter in 1985 created a revolution in publishing. For the first time, small businesses and individuals could produce professional quality printed materials without expensive typesetting equipment. Adobe's PostScript was at the center of this transformation, enabling crisp text, scalable fonts, and complex graphics on laser printers. In 1985 alone, Apple shipped 60,000 units of the Apple LaserWriter, which grew to 100,000 units in 1996. Off the back of Apple's LaserWriter success, Adobe's revenue grew from $1.7 million to $16 million in 1986. By 1987, PostScript had become the industry standard printer language with more than 400 third-party software programs and licensing agreements with 19 printer companies. In late 1986, John Warnock began working on Adobe Illustrator, a computer drawing program that used lines and curves to render infinitely scalable graphics. PostScript was the foundation upon which Adobe Illustrator was built on. PostScript was quite powerful and handled the printing of vector graphics quite well, so Warnock sought to bring this technology to graphic designers, illustrators, and publishing professionals, fundamentally transforming how digital artwork was created. At the time, digital graphic design was still in its infancy, and most illustrations were done manually or using primitive computer tools. The few available digital illustration programs were bitmap based, meaning they relied on pixel grids and lacked scalability. Warnock and his team envisioned a program that would let users create clean, infinitely scalable, and mathematically precise graphics. After extensive testing and refinements, Adobe Illustrator 1.0 was released in 1987 exclusively for the Apple Macintosh. The timing was perfect. Macs were already popular among designers due to their graphical interface. Illustrator was marketed as a companion to Adobe's PostScript technology. Designers could use Illustrator to create artwork that could then be printed with perfect accuracy, a major advantage over traditional bitmap-based tools, which often produced jagged or blurry lines when enlarged. Adobe continued to improve the software with new tools and features, refining the user experience. After launching on the Mac, Adobe would soon find itself in fierce competition with other vector-based software applications. For starters, Apple had developed its own vector-based application called MacDraw. Released in 1984, MacDraw came bundled on every Macintosh and was one of the earliest vector graphics programs to ever be released. MacDraw's key innovations was its ability to allow users to create, edit, and manipulate scalable graphics with a GUI. Although it was quite revolutionary when it came out, by the late 80s, other vector graphics programs began springing up, and it became quite apparent that MacDraw was merely a basic vector drawing tool. It lacked advanced statistic features and was ultimately overshadowed by more powerful programs. The first significant threat to Adobe's Illustrator came in the form of Aldus FreeHand, which was launched a year after Adobe Illustrator in 1988. FreeHand was originally the creation of a company called Aldus, which specialized in developing graphics applications for personal computers. Aldus marketed FreeHand as a graphics program that included all the features of Adobe Illustrator, plus additional features such as drawing tools like those found on Mac Paint and Mac Draft. The software caught the interest of the Seattle-based Aldus Corporation, which acquired a licensing agreement with Aldus to release Freehand alongside their flagship desktop publishing software program, PageMaker. Thus, Aldus Freehand 1.0 was released in 1988. The partnership between Aldus and Aldus split responsibilities, with Aldus being in charge of development and Aldus responsible for the marketing and sales efforts. Aldus Freehand and Adobe Illustrator were locked in an intense competition, with each software consistently adding new features, improving tools, and matching each other's significant features. Windows PC development also allowed Illustrator and Freehand to release Windows versions of their programs for the PC market. The first version of Adobe Illustrator, targeted for Windows, released in 1989, was largely a flop. Its subsequent releases were were met with intense criticisms, as critics pointed out that they looked more like the early versions of Illustrator's Macintosh version compared to the latest versions that ran on Macintosh computers at the time. Aldus FreeHand also experienced the same issues. The Macintosh-centric design of Freehand and Illustrator made them difficult to transition to the Windows operating system. The most popular illustration package on Windows at that time was CorelDRAW, launched by Canadian company Corel in 1989, brought vector graphics to the Windows platform. Unlike Illustrator and Freehand, which were initially Macintosh exclusive, CorelDRAW targeted the broader PC market, making it more accessible. It bundled a wide range of features including advanced typography, color management, and support for various file formats. CorelDRAW's development was driven by a commitment to providing value for money. This made it a popular choice for small businesses and freelance designers. This set the stage for the titanic clash between Adobe Illustrator, Aldus FreeHand, and CorelDRAW. While the Illustrator wars were happening, a new war sprang up over a new industry. In the late 80s, Thomas Knoll, a PhD student at the University of Michigan, was experimenting with a program he called Display, which was designed to show grayscale images on monochrome displays. His brother saw the potential of the program and encouraged Thomas to develop a better version of it. The brothers collaborated to enhance Display into a fully fledged image editing software, which they initially named Image Pro. Realizing the commercial potential of their creation, the Knoll brothers sought investment and eventually secured a deal with Adobe Systems in 1988. Adobe acquired the distribution license for their software, which was officially renamed Photoshop. The first version of Adobe Photoshop was released in 1990 for Macintosh computers, marking the beginning of an era in digital photography editing and design. Before Photoshop, digital image manipulation was primarily limited to expensive proprietary systems used by institutions and professionals. Programs such as Quantel Paintbox and Cytec systems allowed high-end image retouching, but they were financially out of the reach for most users. When Adobe Photoshop 1.0 launched in 1990, it quickly gained traction due to its powerful features, intuitive interface, and accessibility compared to earlier industry tools. As Photoshop's popularity grew, so did the competition. Corel entered the market with Corel Photo Paint in 1992. Both Adobe Photoshop and Corel's photo editing software sought to dominate the market by introducing groundbreaking features and strategic business models. The competition was intense, with each company pushing the boundaries of digital editing capabilities. Corel's Photo Paint was particularly popular for its affordability and ease of use, making it accessible to hobbyists and semi-professionals. Another front also emerged in the creative software wars when Adobe Premiere launched in 1991, which was one of the first consumer-friendly, non-linear video editing software programs. The idea for Premiere came from Adobe's desire to expand its creative software suite beyond print and graphic design. Premiere was designed to bring professional-grade video editing capabilities to a broader audience, leveraging Adobe's expertise in user interface design and integrating it with its other products, like Photoshop. Premiere's early versions were groundbreaking, offering features like timeline-based editing, multi-track audio, and support for a wide range of video formats. Premiere quickly gained a loyal following among independent filmmakers, video enthusiasts, and small production studios. While Adobe Premiere targeted the average consumer and aspiring filmmakers, Avid Technologies' Media Composer, launched in 1989, became the gold standard for professional video editing. Avid software was designed for high-end film and television production, offering unparalleled precision and robust features for handling large projects. Media Composer was the first non-linear editing system to gain widespread adoption in Hollywood. It was used to edit films like Thelma and Louise and Terminator 2. However, its high cost and steep learning curve made it inaccessible to most consumers and smaller studios, leaving a gap in the market for more affordable and user-friendly alternatives, which Adobe Premiere was targeting. So by 1992, Adobe was fighting the creative software wars on three fronts. They were fighting for the photo editing market with Photoshop, the video editing market with Adobe Premiere, and the vector graphics market with Adobe Illustrator. While fighting these wars, a shocking incident took place, one that would shock the entirety of Silicon Valley. On the morning of May 26, 1992, Charles Geschke arrived at Adobe's headquarters in Mountain View, California, as he did every weekday. As he parked his car and walked toward the building, two armed men approached him. The men forced Geschke into a van at gunpoint. The abduction was swift and executed with precision, leaving witnesses stunned. Shortly thereafter, the perpetrators contacted Geschke's family, demanding a ransom of $650,000 for his safe return. The kidnappers instructed the family to deliver the money in unmarked bills. The demand was accompanied by threats of violence if their instructions were not followed. Charles's wife used a public payphone to warn Adobe CEO and co-founder John Warnock in case he was next. She also called two stockbrokers and demanded that they liquidate stocks in $100 bills within 10 days. When John Warnock heard the news, he decided to call the FBI. Charles Geschke was held in a remote location in Hollister, California. During this time, he was kept in a small dark room, bound and blindfolded. The investigation was a race against time as the safety of Geschke hung in the balance. On May 30th, 1992, 4 days after the kidnapping, the kidnappers instructed the Geschke family to deliver the ransom to a designated location. The FBI, having anticipated this move, had set up a covert operation to follow the money and apprehend the kidnappers. As the ransom was delivered, law enforcement agents tracked the vehicle used by the kidnappers to a remote area in Hollister. In a carefully coordinated raid, FBI agents stormed the location where Geschke was being held. The kidnappers were caught off guard and quickly subdued. Charles Geschke was found unharmed, though visibly shaken by the ordeal. He was immediately taken to hospital and reunited with his family. The two kidnappers were sentenced to life terms in a state prison. After the horrifying incident, Charles Geschke continued on as Adobe's president and chief operating officer, helping the company fight the creative wars. In 1994, Adobe made a move to acquire Aldus for $225 million. Aldus at the time had the licensing rights to sell Freehand, a vector graphics program that was one of Adobe's biggest competitors. An acquisition by Adobe would have consolidated the market and created a massive monopoly that would have dominated the vector graphics industry. Serious concerns were raised by the media and customers about the ramifications of a successful merger between Aldus and Adobe. Because of this, Aldus, the original creator of Freehand and the company in charge of its development, stepped in and sued Aldus, saying that the merger deal violated a non-compete clause that had been included in the licensing agreements for Freehand. It feared that if the deal went through, Adobe would opt to retire Freehand and solely focus on Illustrator, which would mean Aldus could no longer charge a licensing fee for the development of Freehand. After Adobe successfully acquired Aldus, the Federal Trade Commission stepped in and ordered them to divest Freehand. Thus, Freehand was returned to Aldus with all licensing and marketing rights, as well as Aldus Freehand's customer list. Aldus would end up reaching an agreement to be acquired by a company called Micromedia. Following the acquisition, the transition of Aldus into Micromedia's corporate structure caused instability and uncertainty about Freehand's future. While Micromedia continued developing Freehand, it became less of a priority compared to the company's core web design products. Micromedia was slow and infrequent when it came to releasing new features and updates. Meanwhile, Adobe aggressively improved Illustrator, so Freehand was rapidly losing market share, while Adobe Illustrator was gaining market share, leaving CorelDRAW as the only formidable competitor to Adobe Illustrator. Corel was also Adobe's biggest rival in the photo editing market, but Adobe had devised a strategy that was going to crush all of its competitors at once. As the competition in the video editing market intensified with the entrance of Apple's Final Cut Pro, Adobe made a radical strategy decision that would forever change the landscape of the creative software industry. In 2003, they launched the Adobe Creative Suite. Adobe bundled all its flagship software products into a single suite, creating an ecosystem that was greater than the sum of its parts. Adobe's products were highly integrated with each other, which streamlined workflow and streamlined compatibility. This simultaneously exposed the biggest weakness of its competitors. Its competitors like Apple and Corel typically had good creative software products that only covered one or two market segments. Meanwhile, Adobe was either the best or in the top 3 of software programs used in most of the creative software market segments. By making its own products highly integrated with each other, it effectively locked out its competition from its ecosystem, meaning if you were a video editor who also worked in illustrations and also needed a powerful photo editor, there was only one option that could provide all those products with cross-compatibility and familiar user interfaces, which was Adobe. Bundling Adobe creative software products also meant it was more cost-efficient to buy their suite of applications instead of buying individual competing software programs, which would likely cost more when added up. The Creative Suite was an instant success, appealing both to individual creatives and large organizations. Adobe followed up with regular updates, adding new features and expanding the suite to include more products. Adobe's competitors struggled to keep up. In 2005, Adobe acquired Micromedia in a deal valued at $3.4 billion, so Freehand was once more under the control of Adobe. Instead of continuing Freehand's development, Adobe discontinued it in favor of Illustrator. Through other acquisitions, Adobe expanded and improved its creative software, gaining mass adoption and becoming the standard for professional digital creative work. At the time of recording, Adobe has a market cap of over $190 billion and is indisputably the most dominant creative software company in the world, a position it has held since the early 2000s. Thank you for watching.